Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is Louis's Wars. And we're going to talk about 5 terms that, as you read more about warfare in the 17th century, you key in on these terms to get a sense of what was going on. Let's dig into it. So, the first term for us to talk about is absolutism. So, Louis XIV is a fairly famous European monarch for a lot of interesting reasons. And one of the big things, of course, for us to note is that he's in power in the 17th century at a time period in which divine right absolutism was in vogue, right? Where the idea is only God can judge the monarch, right? Stuff like that. And here's the thing, right? So Louis is this larger-than-life figure. This is a time in which sort of cultural aspects of society believe these institutional views. There's this assumption that Louis runs everything. He doesn't really. But when it comes to the military, he absolutely does, okay? Which brings us to our second point, Vauban. So in the medieval period, right, which is this very long arc of, hundreds and hundreds of years, the time period where we might usually think of with knights and heavy cavalry and mounted battle and that kind of thing. Armies aren't that large, okay? In the 1600s, in Louis's time, they're going to get much bigger on the continent. And the French armies got a lot to do with that. And one of the big things that Louis is going to be focused on with that is in the concept of constructing fortresses. So building large-scale forts that can survive significant attacks from fairly large, competent forces of the late 17th century, which are certainly involving in the artillery complements that they're able to bring to bear on the battlefield. And Vauban is his most pointed engineer who helps to design a lot of these fortresses and helps bring them into fruition. Okay. That brings us to our third point, aggressive defense. There's a lot of ways you can fight wars, and there are a lot of different parts of military history and of warfare that matter, not just what happens on the battlefield itself. There's a lot of other sort of aspects to this. And you have to consider what is it that Louis is after, because the French army is at war for much of his reign. And it varies by conflict. And generally, right, Louis isn't necessarily out for economics, trade, or business, right? He's there for taking land. And he comes to the idea that if you're able to take a large frontier, you then need to defend that fairly large frontier. And in order to defend that large frontier, you're going to need a fairly strong and static defense to be able to do that. Ergo, the fortresses sort of come in. That brings us to our fourth point, Les Invalides. Now, Les Invalides is in Paris. It's still around today. It's a retirement home and hospital for veterans of the French Royal Army. And it's important today somewhat as a tourist site and a lot of other reasons. But the big thing for us to be thinking about in terms of Les Invalides is that its construction begins certainly during the reign of Louis. But the reason why I mention it is because it's a massive, massive, massive investment by the state in care for soldiers and for veterans. And it's a pretty clear statement that the operations of the state in the 17th century increasingly are linked to that of the military. And when it comes to Louis, that is a real big outcome of that era. All right. Fifth point. War as process versus war as event. So when I was in undergrad at the University of Illinois, military history was taught by John Lynn. John Lynn had studied with a number of brilliant scholars, and Lynn did a lot of work on Louis, did a lot of work on the French army in the 17th and 18th centuries. And he would always emphasize this concept of war as process versus war as event. And it's important to recognize that when it comes to the fighting of battles and the prosecuting of wars, that nations, nation states, or state actors will often engage in conflicts in varying ways, right? War doesn't take place simply in one manner. It happens in many formats. So the idea of war as process is that the tertiary stuff related to the battlefield, the stuff surrounding all of that, sieges, supply, logistics, anything really that you can think of, is also war. The same thing would be true, so if we equate that to maybe different kinds. But war as event, those who would tend to believe the idea of war as event is the idea that war is the battlefield, purely and simply. Now, arguably, of course, they're linked, but the whole war as event is a far more Napoleonic way to look at it. And scholars have sort of gone back and forth over this for a long time, and there's a lot of different, other terms that they would view it as these days of, attrition and annihilation and asymmetrical warfare and all kinds of other stuff. But war as process versus war as event. All right. So for the 5 terms for Louis XIV, we've got absolutism, Vauban, aggressive defense or defensive, les invalides, and war as process versus war as event. Thank you.